morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our latest edition of Office Hours. I am your host, Joe Perfetti, and joining me as always is my co-host, Scott Coher. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Richard Leblanc, who is the author of the Handbook of Board Governance, now in its second edition, and a leading expert on boards around the world. So I just want to thank you for taking the time today, Richard, to join us.
My pleasure, Joe. Thank you, Scott.
And Scott, if you want to say hello to our audience.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, folks. Glad to be back with you. And, we're very lucky to have Richard with us today as we think about all of the things that are changing around us. It's easy to lose sight of the importance of the roles of corporate directors when we think about the changing marketplace. So, Richard, glad you're here.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and Richard, not only is an author, I can't even name the amount of acronyms he has after his degrees, and an expert, but it works with boards regularly. So we wanted to take advantage of his practical experience. In fact, maybe that's where we can start today in our conversation, which is, in the COVID world, I'm sure boards have had to struggle with changes that companies are going through. So what are some of the things that the boards that you're dealing with are top of mind relative to COVID, Richard?
Well, COVID is interesting because it's very fast and the science is emerging almost on a daily basis. So directors have never encountered this before, and most directors are not scientists. And most politicians are not scientists either. So
somebody else would dispute that.
Some will assert. Some politicians may assert that they are scientists. So in other words, boards are struggling not only to keep up but to keep ahead. And so what I'm seeing now are what is called pandemic plans, which is as we emerge from lockdown, what are the risks, particularly to employees and to customers and to other stakeholders in emerging from lockdown. And this includes not, the traditional PPE and masks, but also, depending on your industry and depending on your circumstances, governments at all three levels, federal, provincial, state in your case, and local, have best practices that are emerging. And one case I'm working with right now is, the board is sending dividends to shareholders, but there are several wrongful death lawsuits because the PPE was not adequately provided to employees and to frontline workers. So I think there's going to be a lot of litigation surrounding the pandemic, and they chase boards of directors because the board is the organ that ultimately approves all of management action. So good boards, and I also help good boards, not just the boards that got into trouble, but the good boards are saying they're asking for stress testing of financial statements given the pandemic. They're asking for revisions to the strategic plan. They're asking for revisions to executive compensation. But first and foremost is, what are the risks to our stakeholders, and what are the internal controls to mitigate those risks, and how do we adjust that? For example, if we have a second surge, and we're starting to see this even in Canada with schools, back to school, et cetera, what are the contingencies for this second surge, and how will it affect the business, and how will it affect wellness of employees? So boards now are it's all hands on deck. And in your agile chapter, it's very apt right now because boards are meeting more frequently. They're meeting, some boards are meeting every week, every couple of weeks, just to stay on top of what is happening with COVID.
So there are 2 points that I think come out of this. The first one is role of management versus the board, because it seems like in a crisis, shouldn't management be taking the front seat and then the board be following, or because you get too many cooks in the kitchen?
Yeah. So, and I know that USEAM has Mike USEAM and Ram Sharan have when should the board take charge, and they've got crisis here in their lower left quadrant. And Joe, I agree with you that in this type of crisis, the board really doesn't have, and this is nothing personal for boards, they just don't have the knowledge, they don't have the experience. So boards have defaulted, and we now have a term, liberated CEO, where the CEOs are running the shop, and boards have sort of, because of the crisis, boards have sort of backed up, and they've given you think of a long leash. They've given management a very long leash, and now as the crisis, and I'm not suggesting by any means that we're gonna come out of this anytime soon, but and I'm counseling boards. Listen, don't obviate your oversight role. I mean, we're in a crisis, but you still have a duty of care. You've got a fiduciary duty, so you can still oversee the management of a crisis. So this management line, governance line, which you're talking about, Joe, is sometimes clever managers will use a crisis to push the board up, and then a board. It's very difficult when you're so high to regain that oversight role. So my counsel to boards is don't let COVID push you outside of the boardroom. And with remote governing right now, and most boards, my client boards, are all working from home. So it's a double whammy, because number one, you've got a crisis, and number two is you don't have that sort of personal contact that you would from coming into the office, coming into the boardroom. So it's difficult. You don't want to get too high, but also the counterpoint is you don't want to be in management's face, right? And you don't want to be picking up the phone every time there's a media story about the company. So where that line is important for boards.
Yeah. Joe, Richard, I think about this in the following metaphor. So, many of us have read the Moving Fast and Slow book by Kahneman, and Kahneman and Tversky did a lot of good work when they were talking about risk taking versus risk aversion. And just as you highlight, Richard, you don't want to move too high. Boards don't want to think too slowly. They don't want to become too engaged in that long-term, broad-based perspective. Sometimes it's good for them to move back to that fast thinking where they interact with the leadership team a little more frequently, and they say, hey, how are we doing with this? What's going on with the evolution of our thinking on the business model, given that the environment is changing, so that, thinking fast and slow with the board is a very important conversation, because staying in touch without overtaking the management is important. And at the same time, as you highlight, getting up too high or focusing too much on that long-range plan or vision is also dangerous. Especially if you're in an industry, and I'm thinking of nursing homes and great example. Animal processing in the U.S. and also nursing homes in the U.S. and in Canada as well. That's all it takes is a month of being asleep at the switch, and then you're sued. And when a board is sued, I ask for all the documents, and I see what the board saw. So then I make the case. I said, listen, you saw this. It's almost like a slow-moving train wreck. You saw this, but you chose not to act. And the regret that directors have is they get mesmerized by management and they get sugar-coated, but you saw the data. You saw the risks changing. And when I see disasters, Scott, it's because they're not agile. They're not responding in a real-time way, because and management has a word for it. Management calls it NIFO, nose in, fingers out. So when a board begins to assert itself, and this is the board that takes charge, and this is where I really am supporting Mike Useem, is when a board sees something, and it by not acting, it's neglecting its duty of care, particularly when it's all hands on deck, right? And something is moving very quickly. There's always a tendency, there's such a bias towards, especially with boards, there's a bias towards inertia, towards legacy, even in a crisis. I mean, most boards meet 4, 5, 6 times a year, maybe 5 in the US, probably that one meeting less. In Canada, they meet 6 or 7. And, they meet, they review, they have a 3 or 4 hour board meeting. But those, as you say in your Agile chapter, those days are gone,
because good boards now meet regularly. Some boards meet monthly, but some boards get regular information flow. But the most important thing is when they see something, they need to act. And to know when, where, and how to act, and to pick your spots judiciously is really the art of being a good board.
Yeah, that's a great point. Joe, we talk a lot about the industry of higher education. So, 4,200 institutions of higher ed in the United States. And although not for profit, they have fiduciary bearing responsibilities. So your point, Richard, about when you see something act, we've been looking at the various institutions that have performed well and been able to interact with the COVID pandemic in a manner where they haven't had to chew up cash reserves from their endowment, because the enrollment naturally will dip, or the increased costs of having students come back to campus. This is historic for institutions of higher education. And those institutions doing better, I would argue, are the ones where the boards are holding onto the wheel, engaged, as you said, and very in tune with the leadership of these institutions of higher ed.
So let's just deal with a practical issue, whether it's higher ed or businesses. What do we do about people coming back to the office? What should the board's role be in that conversation, especially when you see people start getting infected in the office? And how's that fit into the pandemic plan, and what should their role be?
Well, there's in New York, there's about 10% are the latest figures. Toronto, it's about 10% as well, 15% of people that are coming back to the office. And I think, when you look at the surveys, the biggest issue that people have is actually the elevators and the social distancing in the elevators. So good companies will invest in technology and have contact tracing companies. And in fact, the province of Ontario has a separate app so that when you begin to open and you stagger, you're looking at staggering shifts. You're looking, because we know the science. The science is that it is an aerosol-based virus, which means it's highly transmissible. And I think working from home we saw, for example, one of the large financial institutions said that they're going to start to bring employees back. Many of the financial institutions in Canada, Bank of Montreal, Bank of Nova Scotia, et cetera, they're banking on almost a permanent work from home with certain functions that have to be hybrid, where they come into the office for certain meetings. But the office itself is transforming itself. So the use of technology, the use of staggered shifts, the use of PPE in the workplace, maintaining social distancing. And I think, Scott's point about higher ed, they actually have a jump on the businesses, because higher ed has already started. And I agree with Scott. It's not a matter of throwing cash at this. There's a way to thread the needle, and in the dance phase, where you've got a hybrid and you've got students that are distanced, and you're thinking creatively about it, and you can achieve. For example, University of Toronto is open for business, and my university, York University, is not. And those are the two major universities in Toronto. So some universities are open. They're educating the students. They're reacting very swiftly to any breakouts. They've got contact tracing. They've got treatment. They've got isolation abilities for outbreaks. There's full disclosure by the schools, by the universities. There's regular briefings by the politicians. So I think it is possible to reopen with strong board oversight.
But in the middle of all that, and I'll just be very specific to my students at the University of Maryland, without giving any HIPAA stuff away, we're dealing with infections on campus, and there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of stress by the faculty. There's a lot of stress by the administrative staff, and actually something I underestimated. There's a lot of stress by my students. My students are just so stressed out, even with the assignments. It's a different world than they were in, 6 months ago. And it's just not something you realize how much stress people are under when they're trying to do all this.
It's actually more than that, Joe. It's significant anxiety and depression by a number of companies and individuals because of the work from home environment. And we're all social beings. So, good boards now are asking for wellness. And this is your second topic, wellness checks for employees and for customers and stakeholders. In fact, in Canada now, our fiduciary duty changed last year that boards of directors actually have an affirmative obligation for employee wellness. So I'm starting to see questions in boardrooms about the mental health of employees and about outreach, regular outreach to employees and having services available. We've never seen anything like this, and we're starting. Even some universities have seen suicides, and so there's anxiety and there's ways of dealing with that. But I empathize fully with having oversight and programs and policies that are available to address wellness concerns, because often it's not disclosed and there's embarrassment, etc. But I say, and I've done work with mental health boards, is put it out in the open. There's substance abuse, there's issues that have become really acute during the pandemic, and it's okay. It's not okay not to ask, and it's not okay to pretend it doesn't exist. It exists. So
let me just ask you, is this then a board committee? Is this part of a dashboard? Like, how are they tracking this? Is this just a simple one-time presentation? What are you seeing? No,
this is, and this brings us into the topic of ESG. This ESG, and for the viewers, ESG is environment, social, governance. There's been three traditional committees on a board. There's been an audit committee, a pay committee, and a governance and nominating committee. The audit committee looks at the numbers, the financial reporting, and the risks. The pay committee looks at your CEO succession, what you're paying your CEO, and the nominating and governance committee looks at getting people onto the board, orienting them, and then getting them off of the board. Well, we know, for example, that the majority of a company's value is non-financial. So ESG, prior to the pandemic, ESG has always been second shrift. In other words, it's always not been taken as seriously as the other committees. I am beginning to see now, because of the pandemic, and I look at this as the third movement. The first movement was Enron. The second governance movement was the financial crisis in 2008. The third one is what we're going through right now, which is the pandemic. I'm starting to see fourth committees or ESG being brought into either the governance committee or the HR committee. I'm starting to see ESG get the board attention that it deserves. So ESG is taken very seriously by good boards. It's also beginning to mature and to be quantified and to be attended to, because without attention at the board level, it sort of doesn't get managed, right? We're seeing, for example, Black Lives Matter targeted a hospital, a major Canadian hospital, 2 days ago, Sunnybrook. I got an email from a board chair a week ago saying that all the directors have gotten a letter from Black and Latino people in the workplace alleging bullying and toxicity and racism. So we see, for example, boards that are saying, well, hang on a second here. Is this happening in our company? And what policies and practices do we have in place that's enabling this to happen, right? So we even see with Rio Tinto, for example, the resignation or the firing of a CEO for not taking Indigenous rights of land seriously. So ESG is front and center, not just now because of the pandemic, but I think it'll be front and center for the next 10 years.
Yeah, and just to add on to what you said, Richard, this is actually a screenshot from Bloomberg. And Bloomberg, which is the pro tool for the investment industry, actually has created the ESG scorecard, which companies are managed on. And this is Rio's scorecard. And they actually are starting to develop metrics. So again, in the financial community, we're looking at this as well, because mutual funds are increasingly making ESG investment choices. And if you are not, responsible and sustainable, you actually may not fit their investment criteria going forward. So there's a financial element to this as well,
Yes.
which is to the forefront. But it's interesting to see how, as you mentioned with Rio Tinto, how it went so far to the point that they said, look, we're going to be, socially responsible here. And if you go and violate the rights of people, you can't be part of the company anymore.
Yeah.
And that's a big move for an environmental space, particularly for the
Global company. Yes. We're even seeing investors suing companies for misrepresentation of diversity and saying that there aren't black people on the board, and there aren't women on the board, and we want the board to look like the membership shareholder base and the customer base of the company. So this is long overdue. It really is.
By the way, we're getting some serious reverb, Richard. Is that your microphone?
No, I don't think so. I'm using my regular microphone.
I put Scott and myself on mute. I think it was just the reverb on your microphone. For some reason, it's very high.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, maybe yours or mine, Joe, as well. So, on this ESG path, Richard, you started to take us down the path of, so boards need to ask, they need to ask the question, raise these issues. And I'm reminded there was a Financial Times article just a couple of months ago that talked about Dominetics, the working from home movement that was identified back in 1969 by a guy named David Kieran. The point for me in this discussion is, are boards looking at the environment? Are they scanning the environment in a way to offer feedback to the executive team so they can ask themselves, how are we running our businesses? Is this a time of change? And Richard, you highlighted this is, the third of three major trend adjustments that you see among boards. I agree with you. In fact, I think it will be the question finally, how do we best do our work? Do we best do our work by putting ourselves, all of our employees within buildings? Or are we able to do work differently at significant savings to the companies and then shareholders for return? So again, just to take us back to the higher education industry, and then I'll jump to healthcare. But, in higher education, we now know that many of our institutions in the United States have invested in facilities the way coal firing plants have legacy cost. It's time to move away from legacy expenditures. Many institutions have tens of millions of dollars in sunk costs looking at how they maintain their facilities. That does not serve the students, and it drives the cost up. Quickly to healthcare. Joe, I know you've got a couple of clients in relations with health executives who have said, hey, we were doing 0 on telehealth. Now we're doing, 20,000 a week. So, Joe, that ties right into your question.
Well, Scott, I want to say that, and this is actually related, there's a very funny movie on Netflix called Desperados. It has no social value. It's just a stupid, funny movie. But there's a line in the movie which I thought was actually kind of interesting. And basically this woman says, we didn't go this far just to come this far. And then she's going off and doing some crazy, stupid stuff. And I think that's actually one of the problems that boards get caught up in. In finance, we call it a sunk cost. And we need to understand that at some point we have to reallocate. And we have to get past the past, and we have to start putting ourselves in a position to be sustainable for the future. And it's really hard to do that, especially when we've been successful in the past, to tell people that you have to stop doing what you're doing. And I think that's one of the biggest problems higher education that you're talking about is having now is we have to change the way we deliver education, but we're so invested in what we've done in the past. It's like, we just got to keep doing more of it. And that's such a hard thing for organizations to do. And I think that's a struggle that board members actually have to try to catalyze for companies.
Well, I think what health can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sounded perfect now.
I think what health and education have done is COVID has accelerated both telehealth and online delivery in a way that, with doctors. I mean, I regularly help hospital boards, and there are doctors that don't have an email. They just use phone. They don't use video, and their world has been completely upended. There are professors I'm working with full-time colleagues that have never used video before, have never they're not very good on email, etc. We've taken health and education, and we've taken it from 2020, and we've probably pushed it ahead 10 years. And when you look at the bricks and mortar for both health and education that Scott has been talking about, the massive expenditures. Like I know, for example, my numbers, I run a graduate program, my numbers, I'm now drawing students from all over the world. I've got students from Africa, from Pakistan, from China. They don't have to hop on planes. They don't have to rent apartments in Toronto. So I think this is the future. And there's data that when you have a significant economic event, a recession, a depression, a pandemic, the change is permanent. So I think health and education are going to lead the way for businesses. They really are. And the nice thing about COVID, if there is a nice thing, and there isn't, but the one nice thing is it's really caused the necessary technological change that many forward-thinking people have been advocating, including all of us.
Yeah, and so digital is a very important wave here that companies have to support. Which, by the way, just a very practical question. In the meetings that you're having, Richard, with these boards, I assume that they're all now virtual, Zoom, WebEx, Microsoft Teams, whatever.
Absolutely.
There's
not a single in-person meeting for the next 6 months that I have.
But you got these Luddite board members that you just talked about. How are they even handling all these meetings? Like, do they even know how to run these meetings online?
I'm training chairs. I've got 6 training sessions with about 30 chairs on how to run a virtual meeting. And some of the chairs, they tend to be older. They're in their 60s, and some are in their 70s because they tend to be the director with the most experience. But even individual directors that aren't accustomed to Zoom and to tutor them. It's like Twitter. 10 or 20 years ago, you'd have that, that 65-year-old director saying, what is Twitter? I'm getting now, well, what is Zoom? Right. So, and even the use of cameras, the use of microphones. So this is all new to them. But you know what? It's just like I said, they have to do it. Right. So I have staff managers that will go to the director's house. They'll put on a mask. They'll go outside the house, and the director will take a picture of the infrastructure inside the house, bring the picture out because they don't want to go inside the house, and guide the 65-year-old director on rewiring Wi-Fi and installing a camera. So boards are just adapting. And the nice thing about COVID is you've got no choice. You've just got to do it. So let's just get on with it. So I don't think, for example, that boards are necessarily going to go back to, the in-person fine, but I predict that there's going to be a hybrid, right? There's going to be some meetings that will be virtual, some meetings that will be in person. It depends on the nature of the meeting. So
again, just what's like top 2 or 3 tips that you're giving people for running these online meetings? What are you telling these board chairs?
Is less is more. You cannot have a 3 or 4 hour meeting. It's the same as a class, right? I can lecture for 3 hours. A board chair can chair a meeting for 3 hours, but you can't do it on Zoom. On Zoom, on video, less is more. So take 50 minutes and then take a break of 10, 15 minutes and then do the second half of the meeting. And be very judicious in terms of your agenda, your information flow. Not everybody has to speak to every question. And try to be able to see your individual directors. There are socioeconomic elements to this. Like there's some directors that are having meetings in their car because they have childcare responsibilities. These are the younger directors. There are some female directors that have said to me, well, listen, Richard, this is a privacy concern. I don't want my stuff, right, visual to my colleagues, right? So they have the Zoom background, and men have this too. So I think there's a bit of learning pain, pausing, asking a question and being comfortable with that 1 minute of silence while people are processing this, trying to recognize the visual cues using chat rooms, etc., and emojis. All this is happening, and directors are adapting. It's not how old you are; it's your mental mindset. That's really all of it.
Richard,
what are you saying? Go ahead.
Well, I'm saying just capitalize on a point Richard's making. So I'm seeing an opportunity for those experienced board members, if they can at least keep pace with what you're describing, Richard, I think that their value can be enhanced. For instance, asking those difficult questions about, hey, look, what are the models that we're entrenched in that we can evolve at this time? How do we move away from further investment in those sunk costs? The deferred maintenance for major institutions of higher education in America is, hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a major Research One university that I've done some work with, and their deferred maintenance is larger than their operating budget. That's difficult to catch up on. It may never be caught up on, so they're constantly in a state of building and investing in, these, metaphorically speaking, coal firing plants. Yeah. So those experienced directors that you're talking about, if they can, have maintenance to just stay as current as possible, they don't have to lead in technology, but if they can stay in the game, they're likely to ask some of those better questions that you're highlighting, Richard, about, how do you remain diligent as a board member during the crisis?
By the way, I do have one other follow-up for Richard and you, Scott. I notice when I'm doing training for very senior level of executives in Zoom and other things, they are actually more hesitant to say things in an online forum that they would have in a classroom because they're worried it's being recorded and broadcast to the world. Is that affecting these board conversations?
It's chilling because you never record a conversation unless, like in some states, it's illegal. So I've had questions about this, and
I can sit here like this with a phone, even if you.
Well, yeah, but it's sort of like goodwill and integrity. There was a lawsuit last week where the director recorded the other director, and I was asked by the lawyer. I said, I've never seen that before. It's an integrity concern because you're not being truthful and honest with your colleagues. So Zoom, I believe, and I think Teams has this as well, that if someone presses record, it signals to everybody that the conversation is being recorded. And I liken it to, listen, you're not going to go to a board meeting and record the board meeting. You have proper minutes. You have a process and protocol in place. So you shouldn't be recording surreptitiously or even overtly meetings. I mean, some professors record meetings because they've got students now in different time zones and they want the student to be able to record the lecture. But for boardrooms, it's highly problematic behavior if someone records surreptitiously or even overtly. But so it's just not. It shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
Scott.
Agreed. In fact, it can't happen because I think it undermines the value of having this independent advice, this independent counsel. And yeah, absolutely right. We've had, the tech team comes in and they set up Zoom in a uniform manner in the organization so it cannot be surreptitiously recorded. So yeah, I think that's important. But those safeguards put in place are part of the diligence, of operating effectively, as a corporation, as a board in these unprecedented times.
Well, actually, the other thing that both of you highlighted was the notion of I'll call it diversity, because Richard, you made the comment about how female colleagues are worried about how the backgrounds are perceived or things of that nature. So how has diversity changed because of COVID or recent times in terms of being on the board's minds?
Well, we know, for example, that diverse boards mitigate groupthink. And groupthink is when a group of homogenous people will prematurely agree and might make a catastrophic decision because emotionally their interlocks, their social relatedness disincents them from asking tough questions and disagreeing. And diverse candidates, whether it be ethnicity, gender, I'm starting now to see LGBT, including in California. There's a bill that's coming through for quotas on boards, and New Jersey as well, to bring forth diverse candidates so that the conversation will change. Because diverse candidates tend not to have the pre-existing interlocks, and they will mitigate groupthink. So We know, for example, that diverse boards they're harder to manage because you've got diverse candidates, but they make better decisions. But I think what COVID has done, and this goes back to the racial issues and the systemic discrimination that is present in the United States and in Canada, and the police, the dreadful police killings of unarmed Black people, is now reaching boardrooms. And we've got African American and African Canadian and Indo Canadian and Asian Canadian have said to me, particularly the males, that the gender, Richard, has, and this is pre-COVID, the emphasis on gender diversity has left us marginalized, and the focus has been primarily on 30 or 40% women on boards. So what Black Lives Matter has done is it's brought ethnicity front and center, so that it is true diversity. It's not just gender, but it's also race. And we're starting to see shaming of companies, as we saw in the gender diversity movement about 10 years ago. We're starting to see shaming of companies that don't have enough non-Caucasian richness on their board. And I think that that's a good thing. We're even looking at management teams and the talent process in the company that might disincent people from continuing, and you might have a talent flight lower down of diverse candidates. So boards are putting this on their radar, and I think that that's probably a good thing. That's definitely a good thing.
Yeah, Richard, I have a question for you. I agree with you on this point. Do you think that there is a way that boards can play a systemic role in helping us find our way through this systemic historic racism, to help companies ensure that they don't react, that they don't just, take a shotgun approach and go out and try to find people of difference to add to their boards, but rather form a more systemic approach so that it can be thoughtful, not episodic, and, not short term? Do you think there's any opportunity there?
Yeah, boards are looking at systemic structure and promotion and treatment within their own companies, and implied biases that and adverse discrimination that might not be deliberate. Well, certainly deliberate is but employee surveys, auditing of culture, diversity and inclusive practices, the auditing of that, the effects of individuals right from the higher stage all the way through to the most senior officers for systemic, and systemic is getting a sort of it's not intended to be negative. It's anything that is said and done in the company that might not be intentional, but might be the result of cognitive or perceptual or some sort of shortcoming or some legacy policy. For example, good ESG committees, and this is back to Joe's point, good ESG committees will say, listen, we need to look at this because we don't want to be on the news. It's not that you don't want to be on the news, but we genuinely care, right? If people are unhappy in the workplace, we don't have a productive company. So we need to look at this. So I think what Black Lives Matter has done is it's said to boards inside the company, what are we doing? And they're asking these sorts of questions about talent management. And we know, for example, when the work we've done together with mutual clients, the three of us, talent management tends to happen when you have a strong female presence in the CEO suite. And we saw that with a recent appointment this week of Citibank, and in senior management, because the right questions get asked. I mean, I ask these questions because I'm a researcher, but if you're sort of a 65, and I'm not painting with a broad brush, but if you're a 65-year-old man, this is not your experience. So it comes from the right people in the right positions, and even hiring of chief diversity officers in institutions to look at this systemic structures that Scott was speaking to is a really good idea.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned chief diversity officer, and Joe, I'll yield to you in just a moment, but not only is that a position that I think boards should be prepared to interact with, but it also ties in, Richard, to your research around, board composition matrices. I know you've done research, globally on this topic. And that's where I was, pointing to when I was thinking about, a systemic interactive being operative versus a reactive or preactive, approach to try to fix something. This isn't about a fix. This is about getting better.
Perfect. Well said.
My only thought
Agreed.
is I have a challenge with a chief diversity officer role. And here's my challenge. A long time ago, I was working for a tech company and we hired somebody to be QA. And our QA quality got worse. And the reason why is because everybody assumed that it was the QA's responsibility to QA everything. And so people stopped worrying about quality because there's like, oh, the QA person will get it. And,
Right.
and in a way, I worry that when we put these chief diversity officers in place, so again, I'm not opposed to diversity. I'm very clear about that. But it's almost like, are we abdicating the responsibility that it's like somebody else's job to make this a more diverse organization? And it's almost like it's got to be embedded throughout the whole.
Right. But Joe, I liken it to, do you remember in business schools around 10 or 20 years ago, we started using business ethics courses, and then there's a faculty member like Joe that would put up his hand and say, well, hang on a second, business ethics should be embedded in every single course. Yeah. And the business ethics proponents said, you're absolutely right. We have to start somewhere. Let's have a dedicated business ethics course, and hopefully in the next 10 years, we can disestablish it. We won't have to have it. I think the same thing is true with diversity officers. To work with other managers and a dedicated person that will be the catalyst for improving some of these processes. So it's not, they shouldn't be the token or the target, much like the ethics was 10 years ago, but you have to start somewhere is I guess the point.
So again, back to what board committee should ultimately take the initial responsibility? If we have to start somewhere, is it like a human capital committee that should do this, or who?
Yes, the human resource. In fact, in the United States, it's called the compensation committee.
Yeah.
So it's always had a bias towards what are we paying our people. But good boards now are retitling this committee Human Capital Talent Management. And they're talking about, and we know this from the work that we've done, is diversity, inclusion, ESG, incentivizing the right behaviors, whistleblowing. All of these cultural things should be overseen by a human capital committee. We've even got a couple of chapters in the book on human capital management. So this is the future, and I think COVID will accelerate this because of wellness.
Yeah, Richard, I wonder. I think part of what our takeaway together from a recent client with you is that training and development is a key. Boards need to be fed new content all the time. We can't expect board members to come in to their directorial responsibilities fully prepared for everything. And COVID brings that to light. So with the work that you've done, and in particular, I'm thinking about a global view here, but in the work that you've been doing, what is the appropriate cadence to bring these directors the continued training and development? Is it now monthly, or is that something where we have to have deeper dives over time and it's more of a quarterly? What do you think the cadence is to keep our boards of directors as current as we can?
Well, it's a fast-moving target, and the best practice is twofold. It's the industry associations, such as the NACD in Washington, that really serves corporate and not-for-profit boards. So it's that, and it's got some 10,000 members, and it's also in boardroom, and now in virtual training with directors. Good boards will have 30 to 45 minutes of education every single meeting. And now I'm seeing it at the committee level. I'm even seeing disclosure of annual hours of education per director. I'm seeing expectations that each director will have 8 to 12 CPE hours annually. I'm seeing budgets allocated to individual directors, $5,000, $10,000 to be able to attend courses, to be able to get regular education and training. Pre-COVID, it used to be education was a luxury, but it's not. It's an essential, especially with the science and COVID, and also information packages by the corporate secretary to upskill the directors. So orientation, training, education is crucial. You can't, as you said, Scott, you can't have directors showing up and just learning this by osmosis. It's got to be dedicated time. And we know, for example, from accountants, doctors, lawyers, they all have continuing education requirements. So directors are overseeing millions, sometimes billions of dollars of investments as fiduciaries. They should have ongoing educational requirements as well. So we're seeing that. That's a best practice.
So Joe, I think that is another Agile dashboard item for boards. How do you prepare your boards to see the weak signals that you talk about, Joe, in the marketplace regularly? We can probably predict how boards will interact with managers, leaders, with some correlation to the education they're receiving. I don't want to create a confirmation bias or anything, but
that's a good postulation. That is there a relationship between board effectiveness and education? There probably is.
Well, I mean, would you both bring up a really good point that we're expecting these leaders to be able to, just as an example, look out in the marketplace, understand the changes in the market. Well, whoever taught somebody how to do that? Just telling somebody go look out in the marketplace, and they don't really have any skill set to do this, or back to analyze, interpret statements. They've never been, exposed to these statements. Yeah. I think it makes a lot more sense to kind of educate the board. As a matter of fact, I assume when we do succession planning, boards probably don't do successions for themselves. Do they, Richard? Have you ever run into boards that actually do succession planning outside of a board chair? Do they think about succession like who my future board members are going to be and kind of groom them?
No, for the most part, no, because they think they're going to live forever. They like the job, and they're not concerned with tomorrow. So succession planning is a good educational tool, not just for management, but for the board. We think, like, imagine if you went to your lawyer and your lawyer or your accountant said, well, I learned that in law school 25 years ago. I think I vaguely remember. It's the same with directors, right? You've got to be on top of things. And you've got to be current, and you don't get that from the run of the mill meetings. You get that from applied training and it can't harm. It can only help. So it really is a nascent industry that is often overlooked by. So we've enjoyed work together and it's only been various boards, but this needs to be addressed system wide. And I think the time has come for certain standards for fiduciaries on boards of directors to have a minimal education component, not a maximum, but some sort of dedicated number of hours or exposure or training, so that you continue to keep up with the pace of change.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in fact, I can, again, back to higher education, $650 billion industry in America per year. 4,200 traditional colleges and universities, and board members are often cultivated based upon their philanthropy with the institution rather than any particular skill set that they will bring. Uh-huh. And I've been involved with a number of fine institutions that have found themselves trapped in this model that is broken, but continually optimized. When you think about what do you need a board member, a director of an institution of higher education to be able to understand? Well, they need to be thinking about the future of work. They need to be thinking about the industry of higher education. They need to be thinking about executive comp, executive succession. They need to be thinking about the things, Richard, that you're highlighting are so important to receive that education on. But that minimum threshold, we're all familiar with AGB, the Association of Governing Boards, which is one of the, more dominant authorities in the higher ed industry. We got to get on this seriously. This is big business, just as are not-for-profit health systems. Yeah. How do those boards of directors form?
Here's the practical part, I'd be careful on how much we say, because we all have some experience with this. But when you actually try and assess the actual board members, they don't like it.
No, I was just going to say to Scott, like, if I donated all this money and you invite me onto the board, and first of all, I'm not sure that should happen, right? And secondly, let's assume I come onto the board and now I'm going to undergo a competency assessment. about what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And this is a voluntary board. Health and education are voluntary. You don't get paid. So let me have this straight. Is that I give you money, you bring me onto the board, and now you're going to begin to assess my competencies. Is that the deal? Right? Yeah. So there's an inherent aversion to the assessment. But we have peer assessment in medicine, we've got it in accounting, we've got it in law, and it's not as onerous. It's everybody's good at something and not good at other things. You might have an accountant that can read a balance sheet but doesn't know about cybersecurity. You might have a CIO that can't read a balance sheet. You've got a balance of skills, and we know from the work that we've done with healthcare organizations, it is entirely appropriate to have a skilled-based recruitment, not a donation. I mean, you can include donations, but the driver really should be the competencies for health and education.
Yeah.
But as a board, it's got to be know thyself. And so many boards, I don't think they know themselves, and that's a problem.
Yeah. Really important point. And Richard, just to try to close that loop. So not only then do we bring a board member on based upon something, and these are all good people, but we bring them on, and then all of a sudden, typically they're then responsible for the evaluation of the CEO, of which they may not be prepared to do. But so these things are sort of confounding. And to your point, this is still nascent. This is emergent, and we're still finding the best practices that are yet to come.
Hey, Scott, you nailed it. The number one job of the board is to hire, fire, and assess and pay the CEO. And I can't tell you countless boards, including publicly traded companies, hospitals, universities, that they don't evaluate the CEO because they've never been trained to do so, and they don't know what should be in a contract. They don't even a CEO contract, right? I've had CEOs draft their own contract, and the board has signed on to it. And then they get into trouble 3 or 4 years later when the CEO is underperforming, or you're trying to fire the CEO, not even getting basic legal advice on the contract, or even how to assess the CEO. So it defaults, and the CEO doesn't want to be assessed in any rigorous way. So it defaults into a sort of pro forma oral discussion, right? And these are major boards, right? So even education on your basic roles and responsibilities as a director is only helpful. It's only helpful.
Yeah. And of course, in a crisis like a global pandemic, time seems to shrink, and that interaction, the shortening of the interaction cycle time that we're all referring to, but now, naming here, does mean, as you highlighted at the start of the discussion, Richard, that, boards are speaking with leadership teams much more frequently. They're touching base, they're checking in on issues, they're helping executive team, the best boards, ask the right questions so that we don't find ourselves optimizing these historic models or broken models.
Yeah, I've got 2 or 3 chapters in my book on CEO succession and CEO pay, just because it's so important. And getting exposure, as Scott said, to high potential talent, and having an emergency CEO succession plan, a permanent, and what that should look like, and mentoring of senior talent, and whether they're becoming CEO ready. This is all not only vital, it's the most important thing the board does. You can get everything in my book right, and if you don't get your selection of CEO right, you're dead. You can get everything in my book wrong, but if you got the right CEO and you've selected them properly, you're gold. So hiring, firing, and paying the CEO. In fact, Stanford University said the average board spends 2 hours a year on what we're talking about, and it's their most important role. They spend 2 hours a year on CEO succession. So it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial to get that right.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. And so as we come near to the end of our broadcast, this is a segment which we call Simple Rules. And I want to combine it with one of the things that you were just talking about and where we started, which is you made a reference to Ram Charan and Mike Yassine, and the point of, when to lead, when to follow, when to get out of the way. So as we think about simple rules, I'm just going to lightning round. What's sort of the biggest tip that you would say come to mind right now, Richard and Scott? When do you lead? What should boards be doing right now in terms of leadership? One quick, simple rule, top of your mind.
Well, maybe I'll go first. Leadership should be the pandemic plan, strategy, and risk. When boards should take charge, should be CEO succession. We talked about that. Ethics and integrity, and compensation.
All right, Scott?
Yep. So I'll go back to the discussion around behavioral health. Boards must ask. They must ask the questions that leaders don't necessarily have the time to ask themselves or even remember when they're running the business. Great boards ask the questions that need to be asked.
When should boards follow right now? What should be top of the mind on when they need to take a step back?
When it comes to operational issues and delegated authority, and that's all it takes is one director. And frequently, as we know, it tends to be an industry director or someone with specialized expertise. Boards need to follow and step back and not micromanage and not get into the operations of the organization. That is the number one complaint I have of management teams is one or two directors that don't know where that governance versus management line is. That's crucial.
And by the way, a symptom seems to be that if you're having weekly board meetings with all the managers, that's way too much.
Right.
Scott?
Yeah, too much. I agree. I can't come up with another one beyond Richard, but I'll refer back to Kahneman. Boards need to be able to think fast and slow. And when thinking fast, they want to stay away from day-to-day management. When thinking slow, they want to make sure that they're not allowing the organization to slumber into complacency, especially back to when it comes to investing in sunk cost or old or broken business models.
No, that's great. And finally, Wendy, out of the way.
My previous point about operational issues and management and contacting staff who are direct reports to the CEO is a no-no. That will drive a CEO crazy. You have one employee, and that's the CEO.
Yep. Scott.
Yeah, I think about boards getting out of the way when it comes to the customer interface. The operationalization of that customer relationship does not seem to me where the board needs to live. The satisfaction of the customer seems to me where boards need to reside. So, get out of the way when we're making the sausage and building that customer intimacy, but ask us about the satisfaction and the value that the customer is receiving.
Great. And I'll leave it there as a final word. So I want to thank everybody for your time today. I want to thank everybody that's watching. And if you're looking for more information about any of our guest panelists or authors on the show as well, learningcommunities.com. Please check out Richard's book, which is the Handbook of Board Governance, second edition, Wiley Press, found on Amazon amongst other places. And again, thanks Richard and Scott for your time today. And as I like to say, you can't drive a car looking through the rearview mirror. So make sure that you look forward and looking forward to seeing you at our next edition of Office Hours. Everybody, have a good day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.